Welcome back. Today we're diving into an epic crossover as Aragorn, the legendary Ranger King from Lord of the Rings, finds himself torn from his peaceful death and thrust into the brutal lands between of Elden Ring. What happens when a man who united kingdoms faces demigods, corruption, and the shattered Golden Order? If you're enjoying this mashup of two incredible fantasy worlds, hit that like button, hit subscribe for more epic what-if scenarios, and drop a comment telling me which character you'd like to see enter Elden Ring next. Now, let's see how Aragorn handles the Land Between's madness. The last thing Aragorn remembered was peace, true peace, the kind that settles into bones worn smooth by a century of kingship. Arwen had been beside him, her hand in his, her eternal grace finally touched by the same mortality he had chosen so long ago. The white tree bloomed in the courtyard. Gondor thrived. His son would rule well. It was time. He had closed his eyes in the House of Kings, surrounded by the trappings of a life well lived, and prepared to pass beyond the circles of the world as the gift of men allowed. What the Valar had planned for him beyond he could not say. Perhaps reunion with old friends, perhaps rest in halls he could not imagine, perhaps simply the mystery that even the wise could not unravel. He did not expect to wake up. The ground beneath him was cold stone, rough and unyielding. The air tasted wrong, thick with something between rot and char, as though the world itself had been burned and left to fester. Aragorn opened his eyes slowly, the cautious awakening of a ranger who had learned long ago that showing awareness too quickly could mean death. Above him stretched a sky the color of old bruises, clouds moving in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, almost malicious. He sat up, his body responding with an ease that shocked him. The aches that had accumulated over 120 years were gone. The weariness that had settled into his joints like winter frost had vanished. He raised his hands and saw skin that belonged to a man of 40, scarred but strong, the hands of a ranger in his prime. This was not the body that had lain down to die in Gondor. Anduril rested beside him, still in its scabbard, the elven blade somehow accompanying him beyond death itself. His ranger's gear clothed him, leather and worn fabric that had seen him through the War of the Ring, not the fine robes he had worn as king. It was as though someone or something had reached back through his years and pulled him from a moment when he was still a warrior rather than a ruler. Aragorn stood, his movements fluid, free from the careful deliberation age had imposed. He was on a ridge overlooking a valley of gold, or what appeared to be gold until the eye adjusted. It was not the warm gold of autumn leaves or treasure hoards. This was a sickly golden light emanating from an enormous tree in the distance, massive beyond reason, its branches spreading across the horizon like the roots of the world turned skyward. The light it cast did not comfort, it oppressed. Below the ridge, ruins sprawled across the landscape. A castle or fortress, half collapsed, its architecture suggesting grandeur that had curdled into desperation. Banners hung limp from broken towers, bearing symbols he did not recognize. Smoke rose from scattered fires, not the clean smoke of hearth fires, but the greasy black plumes of something burning that should not burn. A sound reached him, carried on wind that smelled of copper and decay. Voices, many of them, raised in something between chant and scream. Battle, perhaps, or ritual, or that gray space where the two became indistinguishable. Aragorn's hand found Anduril's hilt, the familiar weight grounding him in this place that defied reason. He was dead. He was certain he had died. And yet here he stood, returned to the strength of his middle years, armed and alert, in a land that felt fundamentally wrong in ways even Mordor at its height had not achieved. Mordor had been evil with purpose, malice with direction. This place felt like evil that had outlived its purpose and continued simply because it had forgotten how to stop. Aragorn began walking toward the sounds, his ranger's instincts overriding confusion. Whatever had brought him here, whatever cosmic joke or divine purpose had pulled him from his earned rest, the immediate situation was clear. There were voices, which meant people, which meant either those who needed help or those from whom he needed information, Possibly both. The descent from the ridge took him through terrain that seemed designed to injure. Rocks jutted at angles that defied natural erosion. Plants grew in twisted spirals, their thorns black and weeping something that might have been sap or might have been worse. Nothing here had been touched by the hand of Yavanna. This was corruption of a different order entirely. As he moved, details emerged that painted a troubling picture. Bones littered the roadside, not ancient but not fresh, in states of preservation that made no sense. Some appeared centuries old, while others might have fallen yesterday, and they lay side by side without explanation. Armor rusted on skeletal frames, the metal eaten away in patterns that looked almost like writing. The voices grew louder as he approached what might have once been a gatehouse. He could make out words now, though the language twisted in his ear, familiar and foreign simultaneously. It was not Western or Sindarin or the Black speech, but something that borrowed from the structure of tongues he knew while meaning something entirely different. His mind, trained by Elrond in the lore of many peoples, began to parse it through context and inflection. They were soldiers, he realized, or had been. Their voices carried the particular blend of boredom and alertness that came from guard duty in hostile territory, and they were afraid. Not the sharp fear of immediate danger, but the deeper dread of people who had lived too long with wrongness and forgotten what right felt like. Aragorn crested a final rise and saw them. 6 men in armor that looked cobbled together from multiple sources, standing watch over a courtyard filled with the detritus of violence. They looked haggard, their faces carrying the kind of exhaustion that sleep could not cure. One noticed him immediately, shouting something that was clearly an alarm. The others spun, weapons drawn with the speed of experience. Aragorn raised his empty hand, the other resting on but not drawing Anduril, and spoke in what he hoped was a universal gesture of parley. The soldiers did not lower their weapons, which Aragorn considered a sign of good training rather than hostility. In hostile lands, caution kept men alive. He remained still, projecting calm authority, the same bearing that had convinced rangers and Rohirrim alike to follow him into battles that reason said they could not win. Authority was not about force. It was about certainty, about making others believe you knew something they did not. "I mean no harm," Aragorn said, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. The words came out in a tongue he did not consciously know but understood instinctively, as though this place had reached into his mind and taught him its language between one breath and the next. "I am a stranger here, and I seek understanding of where I have come." The soldiers exchanged glances, communicating in the shorthand of men who had fought beside each other long enough to read meaning in a raised eyebrow or a shifted weight. The eldest among them, a man whose face bore scars that told stories of survived impossibilities, stepped forward slightly. His sword remained leveled at Aragorn's chest, but his posture suggested curiosity was beginning to outweigh threat assessment. "You're tarnished," the older soldier said, his voice rough with the particular texture of someone who had breathed too much smoke and screamed too many orders. "But you don't look like any tarnished I've seen. Your gear is strange. That sword," he trailed off, his eyes lingering on Anduril's worn scabbard with something approaching reverence or dread, possibly both. Aragorn did not know what tarnished meant in this context. But he understood the soldier was attempting to categorize him, to fit him into a framework that made sense. He had done the same countless times in his years as Strider, looking at travelers in Bree and determining friend or foe, threat or opportunity. "I do not know what tarnished means," Aragorn said honestly, because lies had a way of unraveling at inconvenient moments, and truth built foundations. "I am Aragorn, son of Arathorn. I was a ranger and a king, though that second seems very far away now. I died in my bed at a great age, surrounded by those I loved, and then I woke here." The honesty seemed to disarm them more effectively than any weapon could have. One of the younger soldiers lowered his spear slightly, confusion replacing fear on his face. The older soldier's eyes narrowed, not with suspicion but with the look of a man trying to reconcile two pieces of information that refused to fit together cleanly. Died and woke? The soldier repeated. That's what the Tarnished are. The dead given life by grace, called back to the lands between to claim the Elden Ring. But you say it like you didn't know. Like you didn't see the guidance of grace pulling you here. Aragorn filed away these terms. Tarnished, grace, Elden Ring, lands between. Each one a piece of a puzzle he needed to assemble quickly. In Mordor, ignorance had been death. Here, he suspected, it was something worse. I saw no guidance, Aragorn said. I closed my eyes in my own world and opened them here. If something called me, it did not announce itself with courtesy or clarity. A sound interrupted them, a low horn blast that came from deeper within the ruins. All 6 soldiers tensed immediately, their brief curiosity about Aragorn forgotten in the face of whatever that signal meant. The older soldier cursed, a profanity that transcended language barriers through sheer vehemence. Patrol coming back, he said, and they're blowing the enemy warning. Something's following them in. He looked at Aragorn, making a decision that probably violated several protocols. You want to understand this place? Watch what happens next. But stay out of the way unless you know how to use that sword for more than ceremony. Aragorn's response was to draw Anduril in one smooth motion. The blade emerged from its scabbard with a sound like a bell's echo, and even in this land of wrong light and corrupt growth, the reforged sword of Elendil gleamed with purpose. The inscription along its length caught what little clean light existed and threw it back, defiant. The soldiers stared at the weapon, and something in their expressions changed. They did not know what they were looking at, but they recognized quality when they saw it. The older soldier's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile or might have been the expression of a man who had just realized he had underestimated something important. Right then, he said, anyone who carries a blade like that probably knows which end does the cutting. We hold the gate. Whatever's chasing our boys doesn't get through. Simple. It was not simple. Aragorn knew this from long experience. Plans that sounded simple had a way of becoming complicated the moment reality got involved. But he also knew the value of a clear objective and men willing to stand for it. He took his place beside the soldiers without further discussion. Anduril held in a guard position that Boromir would have recognized, that Eomer would have approved of, that belonged to the fighting styles of a world these men would never know. The patrol burst through the gates moments later, 3 men running with the controlled panic of soldiers who knew better than to flee blindly, but also knew better than to stand and fight what chased them. Behind them came something that made Aragorn's jaw tighten. It was dead, that much was certain. Dead things did not move with that particular stiffness, that absence of life's fluid motion. But it was also armed, wearing the remnants of armor, wielding weapons with the muscle memory of training that had survived the death of the flesh that learned it. More followed. 5, 10, 15 corpses in various states of decay, some so fresh they might have fallen in battle this morning, others so old their bones showed through gaps in desiccated skin. They moved with purpose, eyes glowing with a light that was not fire, not magic as Aragorn understood it, but something that sat in the uncomfortable space between. The older soldier was already moving, shouting orders that his men obeyed with the smooth coordination of practice. The dead hit the defensive line like a wave against stone. Aragorn had fought undead before, in the Barrow Downs and on the Pelennor fields, when the Witch King's power had animated the fallen. But those had been puppets of a dark will, extensions of Sauron's malice given temporary form. These were different. These moved with individual purpose, each one retaining some echo of the warrior it had been, fighting with techniques learned in life and perfected in death. The first skeleton lunged at Aragorn with a spear thrust that spoke of training, of hours spent in drill yards learning to kill efficiently. He sidestepped, Anduril moving in a cut that would have opened a living man from shoulder to hip. The blade passed through the creature's ribcage and something vital broke. The skeleton collapsed, not destroyed but disabled, its pieces clattering to the stone with finality. Beside him the soldiers fought with grim efficiency, These were not heroes or champions, just men who had survived long enough to learn the ugly practicality of staying alive in a world that wanted them dead. They used terrain, covering each other's flanks, calling out threats in the clipped language of people who had learned words were cheaper than blood. A corpse wearing the remnants of fine armor pushed through the press toward Aragorn, its movements more coordinated than the others. This one had been someone important in life, a knight or captain, and death had not dulled its skill. It wielded a long sword with both hands, bringing it down in an overhead cut that would have split Aragorn's skull if it connected. He caught the blow on Anduril, the impact ringing up through his arms with shocking force. The dead were strong here, stronger than they should be, animated by something more potent than simple necromancy. He twisted his blade in the bind, redirecting the force rather than opposing it directly, and stepped inside the creature's reach. His pommel strike took it in the jaw, shattering bone, and his follow-through opened its neck vertebrae. It fell in pieces, the animating force finally severed. "They're getting smarter," one of the younger soldiers shouted, his voice tight with something beyond fear. Despair, perhaps, or the exhaustion that came from fighting a war that never ended. "This is the third wave this week. They're testing us." The older soldier grunted acknowledgement while running another skeleton through with practiced efficiency. "Then we make them regret the test. Hold the line." But the line was not holding, not entirely. 2 more soldiers had joined from within the ruins, drawn by the horn and the sounds of combat, but they were still outnumbered 2 to 1, and the dead had the advantage of not caring whether they lived or died. Having already settled that question permanently, one soldier went down with a scream, a corpse's rusted blade finding the gap between his armor plates. Another dragged him back while the others closed ranks, reducing the defensive perimeter. Aragorn saw the tactical reality with the clarity of someone who had commanded armies. They could not win through attrition. The dead would keep coming until the living were exhausted, and exhausted men made mistakes, and mistakes against opponents who felt no pain were fatal. They needed to break the attack's momentum, disrupt the coordination that was allowing these creatures to fight as a unit. His eyes found the source. At the rear of the undead force, partially obscured by the press of bodies, stood a figure that was not fighting. It wore robes that had once been rich but were now tattered, and in its skeletal hands it held a staff that pulsed with sickly yellow light, a necromancer, or this world's equivalent. The dead did not organize themselves. Something was directing them. "The one in the back," Aragorn called to the older soldier, pointing with his chin while parrying another strike. "With the staff, it commands them." The soldier followed Aragorn's indication and cursed again, more creatively this time. "A deathbird priest. Of course it is. We can't reach it through that mob, and if we break formation to try, the line collapses." Aragorn had fought in shield walls at Helm's Deep. He knew the calculus of formation fighting, the way discipline and cohesion were the only things that kept small numbers alive against large ones. Breaking formation was suicide. It was also occasionally necessary. "Hold here," Aragorn said, his voice carrying the tone of command that he had learned from Elrond and refined in the throne room of Gondor. "I will go." He did not wait for permission or argument. Aragorn burst forward from the line before the older soldier could object, moving with the speed that had once let him hunt orcs through Ithilion's forests. The dead turned toward him, but too slowly, their coordination disrupted by his sudden departure from the expected pattern. He was not defending, he was attacking, and that changed everything. Anduril sang through the first skeleton in his path, the elven blade cutting bone like butter. The second he shouldered aside with his charge, using momentum and mass to clear space. A corpse's sword scraped along his mailcoat, finding no purchase. Another's axe came down where his head had been a heartbeat before, and he was already past it, flowing through the gaps in their formation like water finding cracks in stone. The deathbird priest saw him coming and raised its staff, the yellow light intensifying. Words came from its lipless mouth, syllables that hurt to hear, sounds that belonged to no language meant for living tongues. The air around Aragorn grew heavy, thick, as though reality itself was congealing to stop his advance. He felt cold seeping into his limbs, not the clean cold of winter, but something colder, the chill of the grave, of endings, of the space between heartbeats stretched into eternity. Aragorn had stood before the dead men of Dunharrow and demanded their service. He had walked the paths of the dead when living men turned aside in terror. Death did not frighten him. It never had. That was what it meant to bear the blood of Númenor, to be one of the Dúnedain. He pushed through the death magic like a man wading through deep water, each step requiring will rather than strength. The priest's chanting grew more frantic, the yellow light pulsing faster, and more dead began to claw their way from the earth itself. Fresh corpses, these ones, dirt still clinging to burial shrouds, rising in response to the priest's call. Aragorn had seen Sauron raise armies from the fallen. This was smaller, more personal, but no less vile. Andúril came up in a thrust that took the priest through the center of its chest. The blade's elven craft met whatever force animated the corpse, and there was a moment of resistance, like steel meeting steel, before something broke. The yellow light exploded outward in a pulse that threw Aragorn backward 3 steps. When his vision cleared, the priest was collapsing into dust, its staff clattering to the ground and cracking in half. The effect on the other dead was immediate and dramatic. Those already risen stumbled like puppets with cut strings. Some fell immediately, their animating force severed at the source. Others continued moving, but without coordination, reverting to mindless, shambling things that the soldiers cut down with newfound efficiency. Within moments, the courtyard was quiet except for heavy breathing and the scrape of steel on stone as men cleaned their blades. Aragorn walked back to the defensive line, Andúril still in hand, and found the older soldier staring at him with an expression that combined respect and calculation. The man was reassessing, putting together pieces of a puzzle that did not quite fit. "That was well done," the soldier said carefully, as though testing the weight of each word. "Most Tarnished fresh from grace can barely hold a sword properly, let alone charge through a mob of the dead and take down a deathcaller. You say you were a king?" "I was," Aragorn said, sheathing Andúril now that the immediate threat had passed. "Though that was a different life, in a different world. Here I am, simply a man trying to understand where he has been sent and why." One of the younger soldiers, the one who had been dragged back with an injury, was being tended by his companions. The wound was not fatal, Aragorn saw with relief. Deep enough to bleed and hurt, but the blade had missed anything vital. He moved to examine it, his hands moving with the practiced confidence of someone who had set bones and stitched flesh in field hospitals from Weathertop to Pelennor. "May I?" he asked, and when the soldier nodded warily, Aragorn examined the cut with gentle efficiency. It was clean, at least, not the jagged tear of an axe or the crushing damage of a mace. "You'll live, though you'll want this bound properly and watched for infection. The dead carry poisons in their blades sometimes." "Sometimes," the older soldier agreed, watching Aragorn work with interest. "You know healing as well as fighting. That's rare in the lands between. Most who can heal do it with incantations or faith magic, not field medicine." Aragorn produced a small packet from his pack, Athila's leaves wrapped in waxed cloth. They had been with him when he died, part of the ranger's kit he had carried for a lifetime. That they remained with him in this place suggested something about the rules governing his presence here, though he could not yet say what. He crushed the leaves and held them near the wound, and their scent filled the air, clean and vital and utterly out of place in this corrupted land. The effect was subtle but noticeable. The soldier's breathing eased, the tightness around his eyes relaxing as whatever poison had been working in the wound lost its grip. The older soldier leaned closer, inhaling deeply, and something flickered across his face. Memory, perhaps, of a time when air smelled clean and plants grew for reasons other than malice. "What is that?" he asked quietly. "Athilas," Aragorn said. "King's foil in the common tongue of my land. It has virtue in the healing of wounds, particularly those touched by evil. I do not know if it grows here, but I will look for it." The soldiers exchanged glances again, and Aragorn could see the silent conversation happening. They were deciding something, weighing risk against opportunity, following chains of thought that probably involved how much their commander would punish them for what they were about to do. The older soldier came to a decision with visible finality. "My name is Derek. I served Godric the Grafted before he lost what little sense he was born with and started cutting people up to add to himself. Now I serve because the alternative is being turned into one of those things we just killed. You say you don't know this place, you don't know the Tarnished or the Shattering or the Grace. That's a problem. You fight like someone who's been doing it since before most of us were born, and you carry a sword that sings when it cuts. That's an advantage. Advantages are rare." Aragorn waited, recognizing a negotiation beginning. "There's someone you should meet," Derek continued. "If anyone can explain what you are and why you're here, it's the witch. She knows things, old things. Things that predate Godric's madness and maybe even predate the Shattering itself. She lives in Limgrave, not far from here, in a church that somehow the dead avoid." He paused. "I can't take you there myself, orders and all that, but I can point the way. What you do with that information is your choice." It was an offer and a dismissal wrapped together, the kind of practical solution that let everyone maintain their positions while still moving forward. Aragorn appreciated the efficiency of it. "I would welcome such guidance," he said, "though I wonder why you offer it so freely to a stranger who appeared from nowhere." Derek's smile was tired but genuine. "Because anyone who can make the air smell like that, even for a moment, in a place like this, that's someone worth keeping alive. The lands between eat hope like fire eats kindling. You smell like you might have some to spare." Derek's directions were precise, the kind that came from someone who had walked the paths so many times they could recite them in their sleep. "Follow the ridge south until you reach the stone marker. Turn west toward the church with the broken bell tower. Avoid the ruins where the flowers grow because nothing good ever came from flowers that glow red in the dark." Simple enough, assuming simple meant anything in a land where the dead walked and the sky looked diseased. Aragorn set out as the sun, or what passed for sun in this place, began its descent toward the horizon. The light shifted from sickly gold to something closer to amber, which should have been beautiful but managed to feel threatening instead. Everything here felt threatening, even the quiet, especially the quiet. In his years as a ranger, Aragorn had learned that true wilderness was never silent. Birds called, insects buzzed, small creatures rustled through underbrush. Silence meant predators, or worse, the absence of life entirely. The lands between were not silent, but they were wrong. Sounds came from directions that made no sense, whispers on wind that blew from nowhere. The distant crash of something massive moving through terrain he could not see. Twice he heard what might have been singing, high and clear and lovely, which made him alter his path to avoid it. Beautiful sounds in ugly places were usually traps. The stone marker was exactly where Derek said it would be, a weathered pillar covered in script that Aragorn could not read but recognized as deliberate. Not random erosion but language, communication meant for someone, though perhaps not for him. He turned west and within an hour saw the church rising from a small hill, its bell tower indeed broken, the upper half lying in pieces around its base like a giant's scattered toys. As he approached, Aragorn noticed the flowers Derek had warned about, growing in clusters around certain ruins off the main path. They were red, luminously so, and they moved in ways that had nothing to do with wind. Their petals opened and closed like breathing lungs, and the air around them shimmered with heat or magic or something between. He gave them a wide berth and watched where he stepped. Plants that acted like animals rarely had the best intentions. The church door hung open, not broken but simply ajar, an invitation or perhaps a dare. Aragorn paused at the threshold, his ranger's instincts warring with his curiosity. Churches were supposed to be sanctuaries, places of refuge and peace. In Middle-earth, even in darkness, the houses of the Valar's servants had offered protection, But he was not in Middle-earth anymore, and the rules here were written in a language he was still learning to read. He stepped inside. The interior was surprisingly intact, as though whatever forces ravaged the rest of this land had decided to leave this one space unmolested. Pews stood in neat rows, dusty but unbroken. Candles burned along the walls despite no visible source of renewal. At the far end, before an altar that bore symbols unfamiliar to Aragorn, sat a woman. She was not young, though age sat strangely on her features, as though she had reached a certain point and decided to stop there, time flowing around her rather than through her. Her robes were dark, decorated with symbols that hurt to look at directly, geometric patterns that seemed to shift when viewed peripherally. Her eyes, when she looked up at Aragorn's entrance, were sharp and knowing and deeply, profoundly tired. "Another one," she said, her voice carrying the musical lilt of someone who had learned speech from poetry rather than conversation. "The grace sends them through like water through a sieve, and most are too foolish to know what they carry or why it matters. But you," she stood, moving with liquid grace that belonged to someone much younger. "You are different. You do not have the look of grace about you. You have something else." Aragorn stopped in the center aisle, maintaining distance while projecting respect. "Derek, of Godric's forces, told me a witch lived here who knew old things. I assume he meant you." "Witch?" She smiled, and it was not an entirely pleasant expression. "Yes, I suppose that's what they call me now. I am Ranni, when names matter, which is less often than you might think. And you are Aragorn, though how I know that, you have not told me. Interesting." The name sparked recognition, not from his own world, but from something deeper, a connection that bypassed rational thought. Ranni. He filed it away alongside Tarnished and Elden Ring and Shattering, pieces of a puzzle he needed to assemble if he was going to survive this place. "I seek understanding," Aragorn said, deciding on honesty because anything else felt like it would fail against someone who could know his name without being told. "I died in my own world, peacefully, at the end of a long life. I woke here in a body decades younger, armed and apparently expected to accomplish something, though I know not what. The soldiers speak of grace and Tarnished, and a war that seems to have been going on so long no one remembers why it started. Can you explain?" Ranni studied him with the intensity of someone reading a book written in a language they were still learning. She walked in a slow circle around him, not threatening but evaluating, taking in details that Aragorn could not guess. Finally, she nodded to herself, reaching some private conclusion. "You are dead," she confirmed. "That much is true, but not dead, as the Tarnished are dead, called back by grace to serve the greater will's fading purpose. You are dead as in truly gone, passed beyond the circles of your world into whatever afterlife your kind inherit. That you are here at all should be impossible. The lands between do not reach beyond themselves. And yet..." She gestured at him as though his existence itself was proof of her point. "Then why?" Aragorn asked, the question that had been building since he woke. "What purpose would bring me here? What power?" Ranni's expression shifted, becoming something more guarded, as though his question had touched on territory even she found uncomfortable. She moved back to the altar, her fingers trailing along its edge, tracing patterns in dust that had probably accumulated over years, if not decades. "The Elden Ring is shattered," she said, her voice taking on the cadence of someone reciting history that had become mythology. "Queen Marika, vessel of the ring, broke it herself in an act of grief or madness or perhaps perfect clarity, depending on who tells the story. Her demigod children claimed the fragments, the great runes, and warred among themselves for supremacy. None succeeded. The greater will, the cosmic force that imposed order on this land, abandoned us in disgust or despair. The Tarnished, those who once bore grace and lost it, were called back from death to fight, to claim the runes, to restore the ring, or forge something new. That is the world you have entered." Aragorn listened, filing away details, building a framework. It was not entirely foreign to him. Power fragmenting after a great breaking, heirs fighting over pieces. A world falling into decay because the source of order had failed. Middle-earth had gone through variations of this story multiple times. The difference was scale and the particular flavor of corruption. "And you believe something pulled me here specifically," Aragorn said. "Not the greater will's grace, but something else." "I do not believe," Ranni corrected. "I know. I have spent long years studying the space between what is and what should be. The lands between exist in a peculiar relationship with other realms, sealed away but not entirely separate. When the Elden Ring shattered, those seals weakened. Not enough to allow travel, mind you, but enough to allow attention. Something noticed you, Aragorn, of your distant world. Something powerful enough to reach across the void and pull you through. What would want that?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Power always wanted more power. That was its nature. "Many things," Ranni said, and now her voice carried warning. "The outer gods circle these lands like carrion birds, each seeking to impose their own order now that the greater will has turned away. The frenzied flame, which desires to burn all things to ash and return to primordial chaos. The scarlet rot, which seeks to consume through decay and rebirth. The formless mother who hungers for endless bloodshed. Any of them might have use for a warrior king who conquered death and ruled with justice. You would make a fine champion for causes both noble and terrible." Aragorn felt cold settle into his chest, though not the death cold of the priest's magic. This was the cold of understanding, of seeing the shape of a trap before stepping into it. He had been a tool before, used by wizards and elves and the Valar themselves in their great game against Sauron. He had made peace with being used because the cause was just, and the alternative was the enslavement of everything he loved. But here, in this strange land, he had no such certainty. "What if I refuse?" he asked. "What if I choose not to be anyone's champion?" Ranni's laugh was surprisingly warm, almost fond. "Then you are wiser than most who come here. But refusal is not so simple. You are here now, in the lands between, and the rules that govern this place apply to you whether you consent or not. You will hunger and thirst. You will tire. Enemies will find you because conflict is woven into the fabric of this realm. The only question is whether you fight with purpose or simply react until something stronger than you ends the matter permanently." "There must be another path," Aragorn said, "because there was always another path." At Rivendell, the council had debated destroying the ring, or using it, or hiding it, and in the end a fourth option had emerged. At Helm's Deep, when the fortress seemed doomed, they had ridden out to meet death and found salvation. The visible choices were rarely the only choices. Ranni regarded him for a long moment, and something in her expression softened. "Perhaps there is. I seek to forge my own age, one free from the meddling of outer gods and their puppets. The Age of Stars, I call it, where the order of this world is governed by cold distance rather than interfering divinity. It requires the death of gods and the breaking of bonds that have held since before the Erd Tree grew. Dangerous work, heretical work, but work that would leave this land and its people free to choose their own fates." She paused. "You could help with that, if you chose. Or you could walk your own road and see where it leads. I offer information, not commands." It was a better offer than Aragorn had expected, layered with the kind of honest complexity he could respect. Ranni was not pretending to be purely good or offering simple solutions. She was presenting a goal that aligned with his values while admitting its costs. That was more than most powers ever offered. Before he could respond, the church doors slammed open with a force that sent dust cascading from the rafters. Standing in the entrance, silhouetted against the dying light, was a figure in ornate armor that gleamed with golden light. The armor was beautiful in the way poisonous things were beautiful. perfectly formed but fundamentally wrong. Behind the figure, Aragorn could see more soldiers, dozens of them, bearing banners marked with symbols that radiated authority and menace in equal measure. "Heretic," the armored figure announced, his voice resonating with power that was not entirely his own. "Ranni the Witch, you are summoned before the Golden Order to answer for your crimes against the Erd Tree and the Greater Will's divine law. Surrender yourself, or be taken by force." Ranni sighed, the sound of someone deeply inconvenienced rather than afraid. "And here I thought we might have a civilized conversation without interruption. The Golden Order has remarkably poor timing." She looked at Aragorn, one eyebrow raised. "Well then, Ranger King, it seems you get to choose your side sooner than expected." Aragorn looked at the Golden Knight, then at Ranni, then back at the knight. The calculation took less than 3 seconds. He had spent a lifetime learning to read power structures, to understand who served justice and who merely served power dressed in justice's clothing. The Golden Order's representative stood there demanding submission with force at his back, while Ranni offered choices and admitted costs. One claimed divine authority, the other acknowledged mortal complexity. His hand found Anduril's hilt. "I have fought servants of false divinity before," Aragorn said, his voice carrying clearly across the church. "They always speak of order and law while crushing those who dare to question. The Witch has offered me truth and choice. You offer only demands. I know which I prefer." The Golden Knight's helm turned toward him, and Aragorn could feel the weight of scrutiny, of assessment. "You are tarnished, yet you side with heresy. You will share her fate." "I am not tarnished," Aragorn corrected, drawing Anduril fully. The blade caught the candlelight and seemed to amplify it, throwing back radiance that was cleaner than the Golden Knight's divine glow. "I am Aragorn, son of Arathorn, heir of Isildur, ranger of the north and once king of Gondor. I have faced the servants of dark powers in my own world. I am not impressed by your golden armor or your claims of divine mandate." The church exploded into violence. The Golden Knight came first, faster than something in that much armor should have been able to move. His blade wreathed in holy light that burned the air where it passed. Aragorn met the charge with the calm of someone who had dueled everyone from tower guards to the kings of the dead. The first exchange was pure technique, blade meeting blade, testing reach and speed and commitment. Behind the knight, soldiers poured through the door, but they met an obstacle they had not anticipated. Ranni raised one hand, and the air itself seemed to crystallize, forming barriers of frozen starlight that turned the church into a maze. The soldiers found themselves separated, isolated, unable to bring their numbers to bear effectively. "I can hold them," Ranni called out, her voice strained with effort. "But not forever. The night is yours." Aragorn did not waste breath on acknowledgement. The Golden Knight pressed his attack with the fervor of someone absolutely certain of their righteousness, and that certainty made him dangerous. He fought with skill honed by years of training in service to the Golden Order. Each strike aimed to kill or cripple, but certainty also made him predictable. The knight's blade came down in an overhead cut backed by divine power. Aragorn stepped aside at the last possible moment, close enough that the golden light singed his hair, and Anduril licked out in a riposte that found the gap between helm and breastplate. The strike was not deep enough to kill, but it drew blood, and more importantly, it showed that the knight could bleed. "You dare!" the knight gasped, more shocked than hurt. "You dare strike an anointed servant of the Golden Order." "I have struck at evil wearing crowns," Aragorn replied, his breathing steady despite the exertion. "What makes you think I fear evil wearing halos?" They circled each other, the knight reassessing, realizing his opponent was not another Tarnished who could be overwhelmed with power and authority. Aragorn used the moment to scan the battlefield. Ranni's barriers were holding but showing cracks. Several soldiers had found ways around them and were approaching from the sides. The tactical situation was deteriorating. The knight charged again, this time with a new strategy, trying to use his superior reach and armor to bully Aragorn into a corner. It might have worked against someone younger or less experienced. Instead, Aragorn gave ground, then more ground, drawing the knight deeper into the church, away from the altar where Ranni stood channeling her magic. When the knight overcommitted to a thrust, Aragorn caught the blade on Anduril's forte and stepped inside the knight's guard. His elbow took the knight in the throat, a brutal strike that had nothing to do with honor and everything to do with ending threats efficiently. The knight staggered, and Aragorn's follow-through was merciless. Anduril found the weak point at the armpit where plates joined, and the blade that had been reforged from Narsil drove deep. The Golden Knight fell to his knees, golden light fading from his armor like water draining from a broken vessel. His helm turned up toward Aragorn, and behind the visor, there was confusion more than anger. "Why?" he managed. "We serve order. We fight chaos." "So you tell yourselves," Aragorn said, not without pity. "But order that requires absolute submission is just tyranny with better rhetoric. I have seen it before. I will see it again. And I will always choose freedom over golden chains." The knight's death broke something in the soldiers. Perhaps it was morale, perhaps it was the divine blessing that had sustained them, but they faltered. Ranni's barriers collapsed not from failure but from lack of necessity as the attackers retreated, dragging their fallen leader with them. Within moments, the church was quiet again, except for heavy breathing and the crackle of dissipating magic. Aragorn cleaned his blade on a cloth from his pack and sheathed it. His hands were steady, which was good. His mind was less so, processing the implications of what had just happened. He had killed a servant of this world's order. That would have consequences. It always did. "You fight well for a dead man," Ranni observed, descending from the altar. She looked tired but satisfied, like someone who had just confirmed a theory they had suspected but not proven. "And you choose well, though you have made enemies this day." "I have made enemies every day since I was 20 years old," Aragorn replied. "A few more will not make much difference." Ranni smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. "Then perhaps you are exactly what this land needs. Not a Tarnished following Grace's light to restore what was broken, but something new. Someone who remembers what it means to fight for people rather than power." She walked to the church doors and looked out at the darkening landscape. The massive tree in the distance pulsed with its sick golden light, and somewhere beneath it, the fragments of the Elden Ring waited for someone to claim them or destroy them or forge them into something entirely different. "The lands between are dying," Ranni said quietly. "They have been dying for so long that most who live here have forgotten what life looks like. The demigods war for scraps of divine power. The outer gods circle like vultures. The Tarnished fight and die and rise again, caught in cycles that lead nowhere." She turned to look at him. "But you are not part of those cycles. You remember what it means to heal a broken kingdom. Perhaps you can teach these lands to remember as well." Aragorn stood beside her, looking out at the wounded world he had been pulled into without consent or warning. It was not Middle-earth. It would never be Middle-earth. But it was a place where people suffered, where tyranny wore divine masks, where hope had become so rare that even its scent was precious. He thought of Gondor, broken and healing when he first took the throne. He thought of the work it had taken, year after year, to rebuild not just walls but trust, not just armies but communities. He thought of Arwen beside him, patient and wise, reminding him that kingship was not about ruling but serving. He was tired. He had earned his rest, but rest, it seemed, was not yet on offer. "I make no promises," Aragorn said finally. "I do not know if I can help this place, or if I even should. The problems here are older and stranger than anything I faced in my own world." "No promises required," Ranni replied. "Only the willingness to try. That alone makes you rarer than any Tarnished's grace." Behind them, the church stood quiet, a small sanctuary of peace in a land that had forgotten what peace meant. Before them, the lands between stretched broken and beautiful and terrible, waiting for someone to either save it or put it out of its misery. Aragorn, who had been a ranger before he was a king, who had walked the wilds for decades before sitting on a throne, who had learned that the hardest battles were not fought with swords but with hope, took a breath and made his choice. "Then I will try," he said. "Not because I seek power or glory or even escape, but because people suffer here and I still remember what it means to care about that. Show me where to start." Rani's smile was small but genuine. "The Erd tree and its rot, the demigods and their madness, the outer gods and their hunger. Pick any thread and pull, Ranger King. The entire tapestry will unravel eventually." Together they stood in the church doorway as night fell across the lands between, a witch who sought freedom from divine tyranny and a dead king who had one more kingdom to save. It was not the ending Aragorn had expected when he closed his eyes in Gondor, but perhaps it was the ending he needed. Some men died and found rest. Others died and found more work. Aragorn had always been the second kind. And somewhere in the distance, beneath the golden tree's sick light, the shattered ring waited to see what he would make of it all.